the Everything But Politics podcast.
Happy Monday, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Everything But Politics podcast. We have an absolute legend joining us here today on this week's episode. This man is a retired Navy fighter pilot turned CEO, a TopGun graduate, a father, and an inspiration to many. Matthew Whiz Buckley, welcome to the Everything But Politics podcast.
Thanks, Merrick. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And looking forward to talking to you and Evan, man. Going to be awesome.
Absolutely. And I guess speaking of awesomeness, your life has been just that. Obviously, you have so much going on at this point in your life. So I want to start this podcast off by asking you to break down this word, compartmentalization. Given that you're a CEO, a veteran, a father, how do you think of that word, and what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
First thing that comes to my mind is, as a naval aviator, compartmentalization is an incredibly good thing. As a businessman, as a human being, compartmentalization can be an incredibly bad thing. And let me dig into both those things. So in fighter aviation, as a fighter pilot or anything in aviation, you're taught to compartmentalize. And what does that mean? It even starts after we brief, right? If the three of us were going to go flying on a mission over Afghanistan or Syria or something, we'd brief. And then the time between that brief ended and we walked out to our airplane, we're in what we call our bubble, right? We are singularly focused on the mission at hand, not calling the wife, not worried about what stocks are doing right now. I mean, we are in our bubble, it's called. And then once we get airborne, if anything bad starts happening, God forbid, we're pushing into the target and Evan gets shot down, right? What do? Do you and I freak out and just kind of run back, land aboard the ship and cry and have a memorial service? No, we got to press forward with our mission. So we have to put our wingman getting shot down into a little compartment right here and then press forward with the mission. So compartmentalization when it comes to fighter aviation is critical to mission success. I'm not flying a combat sortie worried, if I left the iron on or, I forgot to mow the lawn and the HOA is going to get mad at me. You get rid of all of those things and you're singularly focused on the mission. Now, how is compartmentalization a bad thing? Well, if we deal with losses like our wingman getting shot down or other issues at home and stuff like that, those little compartments, if they're not addressed, if you don't open those compartments back up and kind of address what happened in them, all those little compartments can kind of build up in a negative way, right? A lot of folks in the military or veterans are too good at compartmentalizing, right? They disconnect from either the real world or what's going on around them. So it's a double-edged sword. Very long answer to your short question. The first thing that came to my mind was, fighter aviation, and it's a good thing. But after, being out of the cockpit for a little bit, compartmentalization can absolutely be a bad thing if you don't go open those compartments and address what's in them.
And I know Tiger Woods' father, Earl Woods, was in the service, and he was extremely disciplined with his approach to teaching Tiger the game of golf. And he emphasized compartmentalization and, really being focused on a certain task or locked in.
Yep.
When you think of that and how great he's been, do you see that correlation between the just strict discipline, like formal upbringing, and then having such great success? Or what's the negatives to that in terms of going about your life?
In this, I love the example you brought up, Tiger Woods and his dad, and taught him discipline and to compartmentalize. And it's very appropriate in golf, like in fighter aviation. In golf, Tiger Woods has a shitty hole. Guess what happens when he gets to the next hole? That's in the past. He's not dwelling on the fact that he just shanked it and, scored a snowman or something, with an 8 type of thing. He's done. That hole's behind him. Ain't nothing he can do about it. It's on to the next one, and I'm focused on this hole right now, not what just happened. So that's a great analogy for positive compartmentalization. because as a champion, you can't let the stuff that happened, mess you up. There's a great quote, and we can talk about this whenever we get to it. When I went down to Mexico a couple of years ago with Marcus Luttrell, right? If any of your viewers or listeners have seen the movie Lone Survivor with, Mark Wahlberg playing this Navy SEAL, and at the height of the gunfight that they're in, one of his buddies is shot, and he's like, "Oh my God, did I get shot?" And Marcus Luttrell, Mark Wahlberg's like, "Yeah, dude, you're living in the past. Let's keep up on, let's get caught up on current events here. We're in a gunfight, start fighting." So, like I said, compartmentalization can be good, but it can also be bad. And I guarantee you, once Tiger Woods is done with that last hole and he's done with the tournament, it's behind him. You got to leave. You got to decompress, right? You gotta get out of that bubble and back into real life.
And do you think being able to focus on one thing at a time has allowed you to achieve things at a quicker pace?
Yeah, it's a good question. As long as the thing is pretty mission critical, right? Let me give you a perfect example. A lot of businesses, a lot of individuals, a lot of aviators are at the bottom of an ocean or flew into the side of a mountain because of what we call task saturation, right? Just too much stuff going on. Like you guys alluded to, I got a million things going on. Well, I know how to deal with it because I recognize when I'm starting to get task saturated. And task saturated sounds like a really big couple of words. It's the perception or the reality of having too many things to do without enough time, tools, or resources to get the job done. So let me give you an example. When I'm task saturated, it's equivalent to me flying in the F-18 Hornet at 500 feet, trying to sneak into a target. At 500 feet, I'm looking at my altitude, my airspeed, looking at my radar, looking for enemy aircraft. Now, if I need to go down to 300 feet, because maybe to sneak under the radar even lower, now I start task shedding some not mission critical stuff, like looking at my gas or the radar. Now it's like altitude and don't fly into the dirt. Now, if I need to go even lower, down to 100 feet, man, now I'm just in don't hit the dirt mode, right? So I shed some not mission essential tasks in order to not fly into the dirt. So even if I do have something that's so critical that I'm just focusing on, I kind of open up my scan pattern every once in a while to make sure I'm not, flying into the dirt, right? I use this example when I give keynotes to corporations. In the center of the cockpit, there's a really big instrument. It's called the attitude indicator. It lets you know if you're going up or down or left or right. And then in my cockpit, there's a bunch of other instruments too. But the main thing that I got to keep my eye on is that attitude indicator. So if I'm getting task saturated or stressed out, I start not looking at some of those other instruments and just kind of focusing on that attitude indicator. So it's kind of I know that's a long answer to your short question. There's a little bit of both. I don't get so singularly focused that I lose track of everything else, right? I have a couple buddies who don't even know they're dead right now, right? They flew perfectly good airplanes into the water and into the side of a mountain and died completely relaxed, right? Because who knows what they were paying attention to, but they weren't paying attention to their altitude, right? So, at night behind the aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf, just straight into the water, talking on the radio, doing all sorts of stuff. They ended up flying into the water. So that tells us that they became too task saturated with a lot of stuff going on instead of focusing on like, hey, dude, your altitude, don't fly into the water. So it's a double-edged sword. You can focus too hard on something to the detriment of everything else. So we call it a scan pattern. In the cockpit, I just don't stare at one instrument. We keep a scan pattern going. So even though this is the most important one right here, I call it a hub and spoke. I'll go out from that thing and go look at all the other stuff, but I'm always coming back to that main mission objective, that attitude indicator.
Well, I'm curious about something you just said when you're like, don't hit the ground, don't hit the ground, don't hit the ground. When you are in those high pressure, literally life or death situations, and you need to execute, in that example, you don't hit the ground, don't hit the ground. But I'm gonna go back to golf, and it's like, don't hit a bad shot, don't hit a bad shot. It's like, do hit it. Like, don't, I need to hit a good shot. I got to do this. Like, when you take the negative out of it, like, don't,
Mhm.
is there a difference in how you approach a situation in a high pressure situation as such?
Yeah, so it's interesting because being a fighter pilot, being an options trader, I'm Eeyore, man. I'm always looking for the bad, right? I never walked on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier and said, I am just awesome, man. Ain't nothing bad gonna happen on this mission. I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread. That's probably the flight I would get killed on. So at least as a fighter pilot, I'm always contingency planning, right? So I'd rather plan for the worst and when it doesn't happen, be pleasantly surprised than not plan for the worst and just think everything's sunshine and lollipops and then get freaking clipped, right? I tell people that, before we go flying, we look at everything that could reasonably go wrong during a mission. Same thing in the business world. Before I launch a big project or something, I sit here before we get airborne and I go, hey, what realistically could go wrong that we could talk about now instead of freaking out the hell out when it happens or if it happens, right? I mean, the time for me to figure out what I'm going to do if I get shot at by a missile over Syria is not when I get shot at by a missile over Syria. I figure out what I'm going to do sitting in the air conditioning on the aircraft carrier, sipping on my Diet Coke, man. So it's a little bit of both. You obviously wouldn't have the wings of gold of a naval aviator on your chest, and you wouldn't have gotten as far as I did in my career without kind of knowing what you're doing and being pretty good at it. But matter of fact, the older you get as an aviator, the more contingency planning you're doing. So there's a little bit of both. Deep inside yourself, you know that you're pretty shit hot. You ain't going to admit that to anybody or tell anybody. But you're smart enough to go, hey man, I want to live and I want to have a successful mission. It's funny because I tell people, because I have my own fighter jet down just north of Fort Lauderdale that we take donors to our foundation flying in. And sometimes I'll be briefing people on the emergency procedures, right? Because we have live ejection seats. Like I took a kid flying the other day in his teens and his mom was sitting there and I'm briefing the ejection procedures. And this lady looked like she saw a ghost. And I had to stop the brief and I looked at mom and I said, hey, mom, this is a 2-seat fighter jet. Your son's with me. I love me. Ain't nothing bad going to happen to me. He just happens to be with me. So don't worry about your boy because I love myself a lot and I don't want anything to happen to me either. So, but yeah, we always plan for the worst and hope for the best. But there is some, I get the question, like you want to have some positive in there instead of just all the negatives. But you definitely can't be flying fighter jets thinking that everything's sunshine and lollipops and unicorns. I mean, the whole purpose of Top Gun, for example, if we go anywhere in the world and we engage with a bad guy who's better than us, we failed, right? Anywhere we go around the world into a fight should be a letdown. If we're surprised or we suck, our training completely failed, right? So we're always looking at the worst case scenario. You don't go to Top Gun and they're like, hey, we're the greatest thing ever since sliced bread, because that's how you get killed and that's how you end up losing.
And Matthew, speaking of training, how did you even get involved in Top Gun? How old were you? How long is the training? Kind of give us a little history on that, please.
Yeah, man. I grew up in South Jersey, South Philadelphia, one of 6 Irish Catholic kids. So kind of a lower middle class family, taught service above self. And we lived on the Jersey Shore, like the real Jersey Shore, not the MTV cheesy one. So I loved the ocean, loved ships and sailing and stuff like that. And then I just loved aviation. So that's kind of a Reese's peanut butter cup. So aviation, ocean, Navy. So I knew from youngest age that I wanted to fly fighter jets for the Navy. Saw the Blue Angels growing up, when I was a kid, and I was like, that looks pretty damn cool. So I went to school down here in Florida at Jacksonville University, and I was in Navy ROTC and graduated. Was lucky enough to have really good grades because anything in the Navy or naval aviation is a pyramid, right? Everybody kind of enters at the bottom of the pyramid, and you just gotta keep being number one at the top to get to the top of that pyramid. So I was lucky enough to select aviation. I went to Pensacola, Florida, which is the cradle of naval aviation. That's where everybody starts. And then guess what? The Navy has a lot of helicopters. The Navy's got a lot of propeller planes, and the Navy's got a lot of jets. So at the bottom of that period in Pensacola, I had to hit it pretty hard, man. So I got jet grades. I selected jets and went to Kingsville, Texas, outside of Corpus Christi, man. It's a single stoplight town type of place, man. It's South Texas, right? Well, because they don't put Navy jet training bases in downtown New York City, right? They put them out in the middle of nowhere. But the Navy's got a lot of jets, right? They have jets that jam. They have jets that refuel. They have, reconnaissance. They have all sorts of type of jets. So even when you get jets, you got to try even harder to get F-18s, which is the jet that I selected, because I'm old enough that when I was going through flight school, the F-14 Tomcat was still, a premier fighter jet. The first movie Top Gun had the F-14 in it. So I selected F-18s, and me and my beautiful bride, we went out to California. So I was based out of Naval Air Station Lemoore, and then I deployed 2 times to Iraq on the Abraham Lincoln and the Kitty Hawk. And then in the year 2000, I won the lottery, man. And the lottery was getting off active duty and getting a reserve job. So getting to fly the F-18, on the weekends, and then being a rich airline pilot. So I got the reserve job, got the airline job in Fort Worth, Texas. I was flying F-18s, and I got hired by American Airlines. And then unfortunately I had one of the briefest airline careers. The morning of September 11th was my first scheduled flight for American Airlines.
Wow.
So I was packing for my trip that morning, and my wife came in holding my then 8-month-old son, and she said, "Hey, you better look at the TV. Somebody hit the World Trade Center, with an airplane." I'm like, "I'm busy, woman. Bad weather or a small airplane." And she's like, she gave me a look, and I'm like, "Okay, I know that look." So I went out and saw what everybody saw on TV, man. Beautiful day in New York City, not a cloud in the sky. And as I'm standing there going through my mental aviation checklist of how that could happen, the next plane hit, and I immediately knew we were under attack. I raced into the bedroom. I still have my old American Airlines uniform in the plastic from the cleaners. I just pushed that out of the way. I threw on my flight suit and didn't even tie my boots. I got into my old Porsche, and I raced out to Naval Air Station Fort Worth and got out there just as they closed it, went to a combat posture. And me and another buddy made it out there, F-18 buddy, and we called down to the maintenance guys and said, "Get 2 jets fully armed and ready to go." And then next door to us was a F-16 squadron, the Air Force Reserve, and they were tied into NORAD, the North American Air Defense. So we ran over to their command post, and there was about 4 F-16 guys. So it was 4 F-16 guys, 2 Navy Hornet guys, and we were briefing, man. It was like Lexington and Concord, a bunch of civilian soldiers. And we're in the command post, and we're looking at the TV, and the Pentagon gets hit. So it was a very surreal experience. I bring this up because you asked about my Navy career, because a week after the attacks, I got a photocopied letter from American Airlines that said, "Hey, you're furloughed. I lost my job." So I became a reserve bum full time. Thankfully, our reserve squadron got a lot of money because we were going to war. And, that's kind of how I paid my bills. So I became a full-time reserve bum, so to speak. And then that's when they're like, "Hey, we need a squadron adversary pilot," which is a bad guy. So they sent me to Top Gun. I got selected to go to Top Gun, and I went through the bad guy course. So there's 2 courses at Top Gun. There's the good guy course, the blue course, where you go and if you're a good guy, and then there's the bad guy course. So I went to Top Gun to learn how to be a bad guy, to fly enemy tactics, all the missiles, the enemy mentality. So as a bad guy, as a bandit, I was in charge of sometimes 20, 30 bad guy airplanes that we'd launch to attack the incoming good guys. And I also had, so up at Top Gun, our alphabet agency, our government alphabet agencies do a good job of acquiring, stealing enemy radar system. So every enemy radar system up in the desert in Fallon is the real thing. So when you're a good guy at Top Gun coming in to attack me, bad guy, you're seeing no shit, real enemy radar lighting you up, and you're seeing guys like me flying the enemy's tactics. So, Yeah, so I went to Top Gun and became an adversary pilot, and then got out at the 15-year point. So I flew fighters for about 15 years for the Navy, and got out and became just another asshole mowing the lawn.
Matt, you're giving us some great answers to these questions, so thank you for that. And it is funny when I was watching and learning about your life and wanting to be a Top Gun from a young age. The movie came out, and then everyone wanted to be a Top Gun. How did that falter out, as you got older?
That sucked, man. That just sucked. That was not fun. I was now I'll really age myself. I was a junior in high school, man. Movie came out. Everybody wanted to be a Navy fighter pilot. They didn't even know what the hell it was, but they saw the movie and they wanted to do it. So that kind of screwed me, because literally the year Top Gun was released, the Navy was running ads in the New York Times for naval aviators. They needed fighter pilots so badly, they were like advertising in newspapers. And then the movie came out, and they've never looked back. So it sucked, because I was kind of coasting. I was studying and trying to get good grades and stuff. But when that happened, I really had to push it up. So I buckled under pretty good. I had to really apply myself, because everybody and their mother wanted to do it. And this is a funny story, man, because I had a couple buddies that went to the Naval Academy, and they ended up flying, obviously, before the movie came out. And one guy was a forestry major. And here's why I bring this up, because when I went to college and NROTC, the instructors were like, "Oh, you want to fly jets?" I'm like, "Yeah, man." And they're like, "Well, you need to be an engineering major or a physics or aeronautical." I'm like, "Woo, I want to be a political science major, man. I want to have fun and party my ass off and then go fly fighter jets." They're like, "No, you must be an engineering major." So I called some of my buddies who went before me. They're like, "Dude, that's the biggest lie in the world. I'm a forestry major. The Navy's going to teach you what you need to know to fly a fighter jet. Don't listen to them. Go political science, get good grades, because your GPA is like a big deciding factor." I'm like, "All right." So I told my naval science instructor, and he's like, "Oh, that's a stupid decision." Guess what happened? My buddies, my best friends, a couple fraternity brothers that listened and went engineering, they were miserable for 4 years. They studied their ass off, and they got like 2.0, 2.5 GPAs. Guess what happened? I got aviation, and they ended up driving a boat somewhere, man, and chipping paint and like rowing a boat. I remember I was off the coast of San Diego teaching some young Marines how to land the F-18 aboard the boat, and I'm in the wardroom, kind of where we eat. And this guy taps me on the shoulder, and he's like, "Hey, Matt." And I'm Whiz, man. I'm on a carrier. I'm Whiz. I'm like, "Who's calling me Matt?" I look at this guy. He's got like grease on his face and shit. It's an old guy from my ROTC unit. He's like, "Hey, man, how are you?" I'm like, "Oh, hey, what's up, buddy?" So I didn't listen to the Navy lies, and got aviation. The guys that listened ended up driving boats. So that made all the difference.
So funny. And where does that name Wiz stem from?
Oh man, dude, that's a 10 drink minimum. That's not a safe for family consumption. Let's just say that fighter pilot call signs are not endearing nicknames. You earn your call sign, and it's usually by doing something stupid. So I'll leave it at that. It definitely doesn't have to do with anything at all with intelligence.
That's so funny. I guess you and I are gonna have to get together at hijinks then.
There we go. We might need to have a drink, and you'll get the real story.
That's so. And then at the time in the '80s with the Top Gun movie coming out, how long did it take for the excitement of everyone wanting to be a Top Gun to kind of wind down, and then you kind of were back on the path by yourself?
So 1991, when I graduated, got commissioned, got selected for flight, there was a big unfortunate event in naval aviation. So we had just won Desert Storm, the world's fourth largest air force and military. We just beat the shit out of them in like essentially 2.5 days. So there was a big convention of Navy fighter pilots in Las Vegas that got a little bit out of hand. and it made national news. So that it was called the Tailhook Convention. So that was kind of ugly. Up until that point, females were not allowed to fly in combat roles. But after the tailhook fiasco, there was female congressmen, and there was political pressure. Like, all right, man, your old boys network is over with. We're going to start letting women fly in combat. And so that's kind of when the luster started to fade a little bit. Was in the early to mid 90s. And then obviously Maverick coming out last year kind of reignited that. But yeah, so I'd say, mid 90s is when it started to peter out.
And do people always ask you about the movie?
They do, but I mean, if you mention the movie when you're at Top Gun, it's like $100 fine into the drinking fund. Like you can't even. So we don't talk about it. But yeah, I mean, people do. You want my 2 cents? The first one was fantastic. I mean, it was actually a more believable storyline. The second one was comical, right? The only reason I liked Maverick was one of my best friends was the technical advisor. The Navy gave him 2-year orders to Paramount. I mean, he was best friends with Bruckheimer and Tom Cruise. So I liked the second one because they actually flew the actors. I mean, those, the clips of them like passing out in the jet is them passing out in the jet. So they beat the shit out of the actors in the second one. But the storyline, without a doubt, was the most embarrassing thing that I've ever witnessed. It's comical, right? So let me get this straight. So our current crop of Top Gun graduates suck so bad that we have to call a 58-year-old out of retirement to come teach them. I mean, it defies expectations. And, the fact that they couldn't even name the country, like it's not Iran, but we're not even going to name it. And then on a good day in the United States Navy, it took an act of Congress to get an F-14 Tomcat airborne, man. And we got the best maintenance folks in the world. You're not landing in some country. The only other country in the world that flies the Tomcat is Iran. You're not jumping in a Tomcat in Iran, and that thing's getting, able to get airborne with live missiles and all sorts of shit. And the fact that the dude ejected, he's 60, and that guy ejected. He ain't going running through the woods, dude. He's lucky he'd survived that ejection without breaking everything in his body. So I could sit here and rip the movie to shreds. I mean, the best thing that could have happened to Maverick was he died saving Goose's son. I mean, pass the torch, but Tom, it's an ATM, so I guess that wasn't going to happen.
So
yeah,
comparing like flying a jet to like a huge plane like American Airlines, what are like the differences in? I would assume the jet it's got to be much more difficult to fly.
You know what? It's interesting because it might be actually backwards. So flying an airliner, it's an 18-wheeler. I mean, you put in like a control input and you pull out your calendar to see how long it takes for that to happen. So it sucks. Compare the, driving an 18-wheeler to a Ferrari. So, but it depends on the flying, right? So airliners are built for what? Straight and level, man. Ain't no big maneuvers or anything. A 30-degree angle of bank is a lot for an airliner. So it's just a different level of flying. Before I went to American Airlines, I was at FedEx for about 10 months, and I was miserable, man. I hated FedEx. I'd show up to work in Memphis at like midnight and fly packages until 8 in the morning and, trying to get to the hotel and sleep during the day. I was miserable. So, I did fly for FedEx for about 8 months and then left to go to American. But it's not flying, man. I mean, you rotate, you take off at 1,000 feet, you engage the autopilot, you're drinking coffee and eating. And then at 1,000 feet coming in for landing, you turn off the autopilot and it lands. It's just the most, I physically can't say I'm happy for 9/11 because that sounds horrific. 9/11 changed the arc of my life. I would have been miserable as an airline pilot, locked in the front of a piece of pressurized aluminum for 8 hours a day. Is not who I am. So 9/11 changed the arc of my life and didn't do that. But flying a fighter, like the F-18's pretty easy. You got a flight control computer and the hardest airplane I ever flew was a Cessna 172. You got, yaw and pitch and, it's slow and all these course corrections. I mean, the F-18 handles like a dream. So yeah, it's just I can't even compare the two types of flying, airliner versus a fighter jet. It's not even close.
And did you have to do different training to fly like a FedEx or American airline plane?
Oh
Or
God, yeah. It was 4 to 6 months of training to go from a fighter jet to an airliner. Now, all the guys in the Air Force and the Navy that flew big cargo jets and shit, or bombers, they walked right into it and they were fine. But me, I actually had to slow my thinking down. I actually some fighter guys, it's a pretty tough transition from an airliner to or from a fighter jet to an airliner, and it's a bigger transition for a single seat fighter pilot, right? So I wasn't like Goose and Maverick. I didn't have anybody. It was just me. I was a single seat fighter pilot. I could do whatever I wanted with the airplane. In an airliner, now you got another dude or lady in the cockpit, and there's a whole, crew mentality. It's very difficult. I was the pilot in command of my aircraft. I signed for the jet every time I went flying. But in an airliner, you're showing up to work with a guy you might not have ever met before in your life, who could be a complete idiot. So airlines suck. It's just ain't no fun in the airlines. Trust me.
Yeah. There's a lot to uncover, Matthew, on, veterans and their place in America right now. But with a lot of these pilot veterans, do most of them find work after their service with, FedEx, UPS, these airlines? Is that kind of the standard?
Yeah, the career progression for a military aviator, if you don't want to do your 20 and get a military retirement, is the airlines. And there are a lot of guys who do the full 20 and retire in their 40s or whatever and still go to the airlines. So yeah, it's sad because I was forced, right? 9/11 forced me, hey dude, you ain't an airline pilot anymore. The industry just, might not even survive these 9/11 attacks. So I ended up going to Wall Street. A lot of either military pilots or, a lot of military pilots think that that's their only skill is like, hey, man, I flew jets in the Navy. I got to go be an airline pilot. Not realizing that everything they learned flying a fighter jet is all of those skills are transferable to any sort of business. I went up to Chicago and I helped run a multi-billion-dollar volatility arbitrage firm just because of everything I learned in the military as a naval officer first, leadership, right? Because businesses can teach you how to make a widget or how to trade or that type of stuff. Businesses cannot teach you how to be a leader. And at the age of 24, 25, I went to my first fighter squadron and I'm like, hey, where's my fighter jet? And the commanding officer's like, yeah, we'll get to that later, dude. Here's your division. You have 22 sailors working for you, 2 chiefs who, when you were playing soccer as a kid, were probably sailing off the coast of Vietnam. Good luck. So you immediately get thrown into the leadership crucible as a Navy officer. So while most guys and gals leave fighter aviation and go to the airlines, there are some enterprising folks who realize like they'd be miserable doing that and go to Wall Street or go do other things. But I'd say the vast majority of military aviators do go to the airlines.
And when you were that naive 24-year-old kid, how much of what was expected of you at the time and contributed to your work ethic and discipline that has allowed you to be a CEO and been successful at this point in your life?
All of it, man. There really wasn't any room for error, right? It was sink or swim, man. There's no room for error airborne, and then there's very little room for error as an officer in a squadron. And you're always competing too, right? At the end of every year, the commanding officer had to rank all of the junior officers from number 1 to number 15 or whatever. So it was you had to perform, right? So if you wanted to do anything cool in your military career, you had to be the number 1 or number 2 JO, junior officer. Yeah. So it was you had to. Yeah, there was no room. Failure wasn't an option. You just had to do it. And folks who did fail in that environment weren't kept around. You were gone. It's a
Yeah.
very unforgiving environment.
It's funny because you experience both of these cultures and lives. Which hazing is more difficult, the fraternity life or within the military?
Probably the military, man. I mean, the fraternity hazing you can get over. I mean, that's stupid. But the military hazing, the professional, because after every flight, you go through what's called a debrief. I mean, you debrief that mission. You don't land from a flight and go, all right, yeah, let's go to the bar. I mean, hell, at Top Gun, there were some debriefs that landed that uh, 6, 7, 8 hour debriefs for a 45-minute, maybe an hour mission. Because you are ripped apart on everything, man, because it's about continuous improvement and getting better. I've been in big movie theater type of big spaces where you're watching the whole engagement on that big screen. And if you're a guy and you shine your ass and look like an idiot, it's in front of 100 other fighter pilots. It's not a forgiving environment, man. So you got to be very, you got to have your shit together, or it's not going to look good publicly. So there is a little bit of public humiliation that goes on. It's professional. It's not personal, man.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're in a big theater like that, like, all right, who's blue two? I am. All right, you're out of your altitude block. That's a training rule violation. I mean, you gotta, you gotta know that you're going to be publicly shined if you do anything wrong. And in our environment, you had to fess up first, right? At the beginning of every debrief, we go around the room and we allow people to fess up, like we call them safeties. Hey, any safeties? Anybody want to get anything off your chest now? Because as we get into the debrief, if you didn't fess this shit up and we surface it later, now you're in trouble. So it's, it's a very unforgiving atmosphere if you don't self-identify your mistakes. If somebody else has to point out that you're an idiot, you're in a lot of trouble.
Your first time being deployed and being overseas, it's one thing to learn about what's over there, but to see with your own eyes, what was that perspective like?
Man, for a kid that, when I left New Jersey to go to college in Florida, I thought Florida was the other side of the world, man. I'm a poor kid from South Jersey and South Philadelphia. I thought Florida was a different planet. Going, so we left California and we'd go to Hawaii, we'd go to Hong Kong, Singapore, and then around India into the Persian Gulf. So my first, putting eyes on different portions of the world, it was incredible to me. But, the Persian Gulf, man, it's a lake. I mean, up at 30,000 feet over the Gulf, you can see Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman. And going into these countries, man, it is a different, it's a different part of the world, man. So a little bit of a culture shock, walking around Dubai or Saudi Arabia, where the women are forced to wear the abayas and stuff like that. I mean, even our females, when they got off the ship, they had to wear, the headgear and all that type of stuff. So definitely a culture shock for me that I had to assimilate to. But it was cool, man. I mean, seeing other human beings, seeing other countries, seeing other cultures and customs and traditions, it definitely was. It was pretty neat. But it also left me with the sometimes obvious statement of, man, we got it pretty damn good in this country.
Yeah.
We are without a doubt the best country on the planet. And I'm not saying that with any sort of American exceptionalism. I'm just stating it as a fact. I mean, I flew into Pakistan and I got to fly in the back seat of a MiG out of a Pakistani Air Force base. And we're taxiing out to take off. Up to the fence of this Air Force base was shanties and shacks and homeless, like multiple story shacks. And I mean, it was just seeing the poverty and the, yeah, man, we got it pretty good. So yeah, it was a little bit of a culture shock, but it did leave me with the resounding, I can't wait to get home, man. We rock.
Yeah.
And what other countries would you maybe compare America to? Obviously, America's the best, and gave you that grateful perspective. But what other countries kind of compare and have it similar to how we have it?
Australia. I'd move there tomorrow, man. I went to Australia on my second cruise. My wife got to fly down and meet me. Unbelievable. The people, the temperature, it's like a clean 1950s America, man. We went to Perth, which just reminded me of San Diego when it wasn't such a shithole. And then we went to Tasmania, which is
Cool.
off the coast of Australia down to the south. We went to Hobart. These people, man, could not have been nicer. You walked into a bar, you know, in your Navy uniform. I didn't buy a beer. I mean, these people, very appreciative of the United States because they still remember World War II. I mean, they were an ally of ours in World War II, and we staved off an invasion from Japan of Australia. So they love the Yanks, man.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'd move there tomorrow, man. Nicest people, respectful, and they love the United States. We really helped them out in World War II. I mean, hell, we have a big submarine deal with them. They fly the F-18 Hornet, so they flew. I love any country that flies the F-18. So the only country that I'd equate to the United States is Australia, and that any country that was founded as a penal colony to Great Britain, harboring a bunch of drunks. And my wife and I went to, what was it called? Port Stanley, I think it's called, or Port Townsend. Unfortunately, they had a mass shooting there one time. It was like the biggest shooting in Australia's history, but I forget the name. But we went to the prison there, and it's like from the 1800s. And I remember, I think I saw a Buckley from like County Cork, Ireland, crime, stole a loaf of bread to feed his family.
Oh.
I mean, arrested in England or Ireland and sent around the world for stealing a loaf of bread, man. So the country was started as a penal colony. So they have kind of a cool laid back attitude like, hey, man, we like to have fun down here. We're the outcasts.
Yeah.
Do you still like to travel a lot nowadays?
Yeah, no, I mean the main travel I'm doing nowadays is for the No Fallen Heroes Foundation. So down to Mexico, down to Costa Rica. Fortunately or unfortunately, it depends on how it goes. I might be heading to Gabon, Africa, in a couple months. We're shooting a docu-series about veterans and psychedelic assisted therapy, and I might be going to Gabon, which is Central West Africa, because that's where the Iboga root is from. It's the most powerful psychedelic on the planet, and you got to go there to get initiated into a tribe. Mainly my travel nowadays is for the mission.
Tell us about the mission and No Fallen Heroes and what you guys are building.
Yeah, so the No Fallen Heroes Foundation, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We provide healing grants to veterans, first responders, and their families to do psychedelic assisted therapy. Why first responders? Because a lot of veterans, when they get off active duty and they take that uniform off, they go home and they put on the city, county, state uniform of a first responder. And just when they took that active duty uniform off, they didn't take off the trauma that was associated with it, did they? And now as a first responder, a lot of them are seeing a hell of a lot more trauma. I have a buddy, 20-year Marine, who went to fire rescue down in Miami. He's like, my 20 years in the Marine Corps was a complete joke compared to what I've seen and experienced as a first responder in Miami. Children and just some horrific things people can do to other human beings. So we help veterans, first responders, and then their family members, because family members serve too, especially if you've lost a loved one, a Gold Star parent or spouse. So we provide those healing grants because 3 years ago, I went down to Mexico with Marcus Luttrell, and then one of the founders of Black Rifle Coffee, Jared Taylor, another Navy SEAL, and an NFL player who was suffering from really severe CTE, the head trauma. And I did ibogaine and 5-MeO DMT, and it was without a doubt the most spiritual, life-saving, life-changing experience of my 52 years. I got home and I said, this is how we're going to end veteran suicide. Because currently, when I started this foundation 3 years ago, the number was 22. 22 veterans a day take their own life, which is just it's obscene. That's a mass shooting. Every day there's a mass shooting in the veteran community. Well, about a year and a half ago, a couple small community colleges, Duke University and the University of Alabama, they dug into Uncle Sam's numbers. And guess what they found? Uncle Sam only was counting violent veteran suicides. So when these two fine institutions dug into Uncle Sam's numbers, they said it's closer to 44 veterans a day. It's double. Why? Drugs and alcohol. They went and talked to people and they're like, no, that guy drank himself to death, or she overdosed. Yeah, that was a suicide. She didn't want to live anymore. So when they dug into the numbers, man, it's double. And this administration is not going to have a press conference that says, oh, by the way, the numbers just doubled. Any questions? It's kind of on the it's sad. It breaks my heart. So my mission objective at the No Fallen Heroes Foundation is to use these healing medicines to get that number as close as we can to zero. So we go to Costa Rica, Mexico. We did our first healing retreat in the United States at the end of October because it pissed me off, man. You're telling me I got to take guys and gals to another country to heal the trauma that they incurred serving this one? So thank you to the great state of Oregon and thank you to the great state of Colorado. These medicines are legal on the state level. So we did a healing retreat in October in Colorado, and because my mission objective has always been to heal our heroes at home, and now we're starting to do that. And one of the guys that came to the Colorado retreat was a first responder to the Columbine massacre. This guy was one of the first guys in the library at Columbine, and this dude, when he showed up on Thursday, he looked like he was the first guy at the Columbine massacre. And then when he left that retreat Monday morning, he was a different human being. So really excited about our mission. I don't want any of our veterans to have to come out of pocket for this treatment. Ultimately, my mission objective is to not be doing this. I shouldn't be doing this. There shouldn't be a No Fallen Heroes Foundation. The VA should be doing this, but the military does an incredibly good job of training us to do some pretty awful things to another human being. And then when they're done with us, they do a really shitty job of transitioning us back to being a human being. So my mission objective is to try and help these people figure out who they truly are once again, not all this trauma and everything else that happened to them.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking to hear about the suicides. When you do have your retreats and you give them the medicines, how do you go about like dosage, like to make sure you don't give someone too much or too little?
Well, I'll lead with this. It is impossible to overdose on plant medicine. It's never happened. And it's pretty interesting that how God does that, right? So you can't overdose on plant medicine. It's physically impossible. But at the retreat center in Mexico, for example, we sit with a medicine called ibogaine. So iboga is the root from Gabon, Africa, and it's got 14 alkaloids in it. One of the alkaloids that we can pull out of it's called ibogaine. So at the clinic in Mexico, there's a doctor, there's a medical director. He's a doctor. He looks at your body weight and all sorts of stuff like that to figure out the dosage. But as far as, when we went to Colorado, for example, when we sat with psilocybin, 5 grams, everybody got a heroic dose of 5 grams. And then when we do iboga down in Costa Rica, the medicine man kind of feels the spirit and pours that amount of iboga into your mouth. And then as the night goes on, if you need a little bit more, you can always do a little bit more. But iboga, it's like chewing on sawdust. It's you're chewing on root bark. So long answer to your short question is the dosing just depends on the medicine and also the individual.
Well, it's funny too with your background, being a CEO, a corporate guy, when you got dragged onto the retreat for the first time, probably didn't know too much about what you were getting yourself into. When you
Nope.
get there and you kind of see like what the energy is, how did your perspective change? Like, oh, we're going to Mexico, opposed to, oh shit, like this is gonna be crazy.
Yeah, man. So God made this happen exactly how it was supposed to, because my buddy told me, he's like, hey, there's a cool group going down to Mexico in a couple weeks, Navy SEALs, and they're going to do psychedelic assisted therapy. Do you want to go? And I'm like, go to Mexico for a weekend and do drugs with Navy SEAls? That sounded like that sounds like a good time, man. Sign me up. But I had no clue, zero, what I was in for. I'm not going to say zero, because there was briefing calls before, I got a little manual to read, but after doing the medicine, looking back on it, I literally had just no idea what to expect. And I think that's a little bit of a good thing too. So yeah, so when I showed up, you fly into San Diego and we all meet, and then you caravan down, because it's a felony in San Diego, but it's legal, a half an hour, 45 minutes away in a car in northern Mexico. So it's ridiculous. But yeah, I was prepared to do the medicine, but at the end of the day, absolutely nothing can prepare you for what you're going to experience, right? And it's your journey. That's why I hesitate sometimes telling people about my journeys, because that ain't going to be yours. And that if I decided to ever sit with that medicine again, it's going to be a completely different experience. But what I got that first time was, without a doubt, the most incredible experience. I was a drinker, and I don't know if you can be a good drinker, but I was a drinker, man. I was a bad drinker. I couldn't even look at alcohol for 8 months after this experience. It made me physically ill. Now I can, have a glass of wine with my steak, but old Whiz, a glass of wine meant the bottle, or maybe even two. Now that doesn't even happen. And 99.9% of my alcohol is gone. And even if I do have a glass of wine with my steak, the next morning I'm like, that was a waste. 85% of heroin addicts that have used ibogaine one time, up to 3 years, never even look at heroin again after one treatment, and they have no withdrawal symptoms, which is a horror, trying to get off heroin. So these medicines are just incredibly powerful. Some of the guys I went with never, here we are 3 years later, they don't even have a glass of wine with their steak, type of thing. So incredibly powerful and transformative. But man, I was that's why I do my podcast, and I try and get out as much information as I can about these medicines, to try and prep the battlefield a little bit for folks who are thinking about doing it.
You're obviously extremely knowledgeable on the chemical makeup and what exactly is taking place and what you're consuming. I know you're not a scientist, but for someone listening, how would you explain what is happening to someone with PTSD chemically in their brain that alters their negative or depressed mindset into one of, happiness and positivity?
Yeah, well, PTS. So we, as veterans, we drop the D, right? Because it's an injury, it's not a disorder. So PTS, it really affects your fight or flight. It completely rewires that, your fight or flight sense as a human. And a lot of the guys and the gals suffering from PTS, that fight is stuck on. It's not off. And if you're always kind of living in that state of fight, you can't sleep. You're hitting the drugs, or you're hitting the booze, or the relationships suck. I mean, it's a horrific cycle. Add to that, PTS is one thing, but like, for example, a couple of the Navy SEALs I went with, they had TBI, traumatic brain injury, right? From explosive and repeated explosions. So your brain gets rocked in the skull here. So you have PTS, and some of them, a lot of folks have traumatic brain injuries. That's a concoction of horror. So the medicine goes in and completely rewires all of that. It ditches that fight or flight and recenters you back to, quote, normal. It helps you with your center. One of the Navy SEALs that I went with, he showed me his brain scans from the VA before he did the medicine. Dark, gray, black. 3 months after the medicine, his brain scans at the VA were completely white.
Oh.
So these medicines, they have what's called neuroplasticity. these medicines, iboga, psilocybin, they go into the brain, the neurons in the brain, and if it's damaged or dead, it makes them alive again. So it can repair damaged neurons and create new ones. I didn't do the medicine to be a better trader or businessman or stuff like that. I did the medicine to be a better human, better father, a better husband. But guess what? All of those things happen. And then, holy shit, man, I feel like Neo in the Matrix. Everything in my life, I don't know if it's just because I had knocked off this fog or this cloud. Everything in my life got better. Look at Aaron Rodgers. He did ayahuasca.
Yeah.
He's like, hey, man, I didn't do ayahuasca to be a better football player, but guess what happened when I got back from doing ayahuasca? He's like, holy shit, man, I was at the high point of my career, obviously injury aside, but he's like, dude, one of the guys on the board of my foundation, his name's Daniel Carcillo. He's a 2-time Stanley Cup champ
Blackhawks.
from the Blackhawks, man. You got it. He was a goon. He was an enforcer, and he repeated head injuries, man. I forget how many fights that guy had, and he was dying. He was on the Blackhawks, and he was dying. His best friend on the team, his name was Steve Montador, 35, 16 concussions.
Okay.
Every one of those concussions, the NHL docs and the team docs were like, you're fine, here's some Motrin. Steve Montador died at 35 in his sleep. And when they opened up his head, he was a dead man walking. So Carcillo, his best friend, he's like, holy shit, man, that my best friend just died. They opened his head up. I'm him. I have 7 concussions right now. So Carcillo went to a brain, center, and they're like, holy shit, dude, if an acorn drops on your head today, you're dead. He's like, what? So he ended up, he sued the NHL, first of all, but he ended up going and doing these heroic doses and completely regrew his neuro pathway. He's a completely different human being right now because of these medicines. So I bring that up because I brought up Aaron Rodgers. A lot of athletes are doing these medicines, not just for therapeutic, like, hey, my head injury, but to just improve their performance. They're going down there and they are doing these medicines. And, I'm not a baseball player, but I'm pretty damn sure after doing Iboga or Ibogaine and it cleared out my head, I guarantee I could be able to see a pitch or something coming at me from, as just a different frame of reference. So, whether it's executives right now, or moms that are microdosing, a lot of people are looking at these medicines. They might not have a ton of trauma or stuff, quote, wrong with them, but they're just looking into, hey, man, maybe these things can just make me better at whatever I'm doing right now, especially athletes.
And Matthew, a lot of what you're talking about is similar to like Andrew Huberman studies on psilocybin. I don't know if you ever listened to his podcast.
Sure. Absolutely.
This is exactly what he kind of just posted research on. I was just wondering if that was someone you kind of look at when you're learning about this stuff.
No, I to be honest, I didn't know who that guy was before I went to Mexico. Now, after I've gotten back, I've looked into some of his stuff like that. So I kind of blazed this path without him, but yeah, he does some pretty good work talking about the medicines. Yep, he's a good dude.
That's awesome. And going back to Daniel Carcillo, I remember we're huge Blackhawks fans, especially when we used to play hockey as kids. He was a total like savage, just banging heads, hitting guys, fighting. I remember him well. I think he was number 13. He just I have listened to his show also. His story is pretty inspiring as well.
He's a man. He was on the edge. You Google Daniel Carcillo and watch some of his fight videos. That dude just he's you're right. He's a savage.
And at this point in time here, it's like April 2024. Obviously, this medicine is being more and more accepted. But how does our society eliminate the voodoo that's attached to it?
It's a great question, man, because even me, every once in a while, I'll catch myself, when I say the word psychedelic, I kind of like, ew. But the government did a great job, didn't they? That creating that stigma. Let's just look at the history real quick. 50s, 60s, great research on psychedelics, helping people and, psychologists, psychiatrists using it with people on couches who need help. And, they kind of say it jumped the lab. It escaped the lab, right? And once it got into the counterculture, it really exploded. But what happened? Right around the Vietnam era, hey man, I'm ordering you to go to the other side of the planet to kill a yellow man you've never met before. Here's a rifle. I don't want to do that. I love that guy. Wait. What did you do to make you love that guy? Well, I took some of these. All right. Well, now that's illegal and you're still going to Vietnam. Here's your weapon. So they stick, Richard Nixon and the whole war on drugs. What's his name? Hadelman, one of his top closest advisors before the guy died. I get the, kind of a deathbed admission like, oh yeah, the war on drugs, man. We tarred African Americans with marijuana, and then we tied psychedelics to the anti-war people. It was our political strategy. So, right now, psychedelics are undergoing a renaissance. Long answer, your short question, how do we kind of change hearts and minds? I ain't nobody special, but if somebody looks up to a veteran, if somebody looks up to a Marcus Luttrell or a Navy fighter pilot, instead of a hippie, I'm not saying hippies are bad or something like that, but a lot of people associate the word psychedelic with, a guy wearing a drug rug and looks like Cheech and Chong. Well, guess what? I'm a Navy fighter pilot. I go with Navy SEALs and first responders and stuff like that. So if we can get our stories out there, I think regular mom and pop Americans can look at this and go, all right, well, if these folks are vouching for it, maybe we can start looking into it. I went to an event out in Denver last summer. It was called Psychedelic Science. 15,000 people, man, at this convention, from Republican governors to Aaron Rodgers, to football players, to movie stars, to politicians, to hippies, to fighter pilots. It was an eclectic group. It was a wide swath of Americans who are all aligned to using these medicines for healing purposes. And let me be clear, these things are not for everybody, man. My ibogaine experience with a 12 to 14 hour ass kicking, man. I was in it, and I'm some of these guys in the room sounded like they were getting cut in half by a saw. I'm like, what the hell is going on over there? But the next morning, I'm like, you guys good? They're like, never better. Holy shit, that was awesome. So these are not fun. They're not recreational. And I strongly recommend that they're not for everybody. There's so many different ways to heal, man. Do yoga, do breath work, meditate, climb Mount Everest, man. There are so many different ways to heal, but I say that, radical trauma maybe could potentially need some radical healing, and that's what these medicines do. But it always makes me chuckle a little bit that God put these things on this planet for us to heal, and then we made them illegal. So it just doesn't. How can you make a plant illegal that helps people? But that's also a little bit of a segue into the threats in this space, which are what? Big pharma. I mean, they ain't going to be happy that, with 2 doses of psilocybin, that 70% of people suffering from generalized anxiety disorder are completely cured. Big pharma, they give a shit about their shareholders. They don't give a shit about you taking one of their products. They do care about you taking their products. They want you to take more and be hooked on it for the rest of your life. So there are a lot of potential threats in this space, and big pharma is one of them. And along with big pharma are the alcohol and tobacco lobbies, right? Because the definition of a Schedule I drug in this country, go to jail, is no therapeutic use and a high risk of addiction. That's literally a cigarette. That's the actual definition of a cigarette or alcohol. 100% legal. These medicines are anti-addictive. Like we talked about, you can't they're anti-addictive. They break addictions. And it was the most therapeutic thing in my life. That's illegal, but alcohol and cigarettes, 100% legal. So it's a joke. Standard government, man, they label things the exact opposite of what they are, right? The Inflation Reduction Act caused inflation. The Affordable Care Act was not affordable. A Schedule I drug is not alcohol and tobacco. So, but yeah, long answer, your short point. I think veterans, first responders, athletes, I think us kind of leading the way a little bit instead of the hippies over here. Love my hippies, but maybe they'll sit up in the chair and listen to us.
It's so funny. Like you said, you can't buy or really get these medicines anywhere, but you can go to any gas station and get a strawberry lemonade vape but none of the good stuff. So,
Correct.
Matthew, a great quote that you had was, "I don't have faith anymore. I have knowledge." And I feel like that really sums up this episode and how much we've learned and have accumulated from your time here with us. So we do really appreciate you hopping on, which has been over an hour now. It feels like 5 minutes. So
Yeah, exactly.
thank you so much, Matthew. You're the
Thank you.
man.
We're incredibly grateful for you coming
Yeah,
on. Yes.
I appreciate it, fellas. Thanks, Evan. Thanks, Merrick. You can go to nofallenheroes.com and check out our mission and pitch into the fight to help heal our heroes, man, because we don't want any of these guys and gals to pay out of pocket for their treatment. So if you can throw a couple bucks at the No Fallen Heroes Foundation, we'd appreciate it. But thanks for having me, fellas.
Totally.
This was awesome.
Looking forward to that movie about your life here coming up.
Me too, man. I have no idea what that thing's gonna look like. So grab the popcorn.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
You bet, guys. We'll see you.
Okay.